There are places in England where history does not fade, it waits. And among them, nestled in the crook of a forgotten valley in the West Riding of Yorkshire, lies Red Hollow. Not a village proper, but a hamlet so slight, it barely warranted a name on Ordnance Survey maps before the Great War. Its only notable structure, long since collapsed into ivy and ruin, was the Red Hollow Inn, once praised in railway pamphlets for its hearty fare and uncommon hospitality. Travellers on the Leeds-Sheffield line would alight at the nearest station, walk 3 miles through mist-laced moorland, and find themselves welcomed by Mrs. Eliza Thorne, the innkeeper, whose smile was as warm as her hearth, and whose pies, it was said, could mend a man's soul after a hard day's journey. Mrs. Thorne was a widow of indeterminate age, though parish records suggest she was born sometime in the 1820s. She kept to herself, spoke little of her past, and never remarried. Her establishment, modest but immaculate, boasted whitewashed walls, polished oak beams, and a kitchen that smelled perpetually of thyme, suet, and something deeper, something rich and faintly metallic, which guests attributed to the iron-rich well water. The inn thrived for nearly 30 years, from the late 1850s through the 1880s, drawing salesmen, clergymen, and the occasional naturalist drawn by the rare moorland flora. Yet by the mid-1890s, it had fallen silent. No notice was posted, no closure announced. One autumn, the postman found the door unlatched, the fire cold, and the dining table set for 4, plates clean, cutlery aligned, but no sign of life. At first, authorities assumed Mrs. Thorne had simply departed. But then came the letters, not hers, but those of her vanished guests. Dozens surfaced over the years, tucked into second-hand books or discovered in solicitors' archives. Missives posted from Red Hollow that never reached their destinations, stamped but undelivered, as though the Royal Mail itself had hesitated to carry them further. In one, a Mr. Alistair Pembroke of Doncaster wrote to his sister of the most curious sensation upon eating Mrs. Thorne's venison pie. As though I recognized the taste, though I've never hunted in my life. Another, from a Miss Eleanor Vane, described hearing a low hum beneath the floorboards at night, like a lullaby sung through stone. Most chillingly, several letters bore the same phrase, penned in different hands. I feel I've been here before. The first true discovery came in 1903, when a surveyor inspecting the derelict property for potential sale stumbled upon a concealed hatch beneath the kitchen flagstones. It led to a sub-cellar not noted on any architectural plan, its walls blackened by decades of soot. There, nestled among rusted tins and broken crockery, lay human bones, disarticulated, calcined, yet unmistakable. Dental work matched that of a missing commercial traveller last seen checking into the inn in 1887. Further excavation revealed more remains, intermingled with animal bones, all bearing the same telltale scoring, knife marks consistent not with butchery, but with careful defleshing. The local constabulary, overwhelmed and embarrassed, quietly sealed the site. Officially, the case was attributed to a deranged individual acting alone, though no body of Mrs. Thorne was ever found. For decades, Red Hollow faded into local legend, a cautionary tale told to children, a footnote in county annals. But in 1921, a young antiquarian named Dr. Lionel Ashworth, then compiling a history of Yorkshire inns, became fixated on the silence surrounding the case. He combed through parish registers, railway logs, and asylum records, uncovering a pattern too precise to be coincidence. Every guest who vanished had stayed during the waning moon of October, the same week each year. More disturbingly, each had signed the guest ledger with a flourish that, under magnification, revealed a faint underdrawing, a looping sigil resembling a closed eye. Ashworth tracked down the last known survivor, a retired vicar in Scarborough who, as a boy, had accompanied his father to Red Hollow in 1881. The old man, trembling, recalled that after dinner, Mrs. Thorne played a tune on a small harmonium in the parlour, a melody without words, slow and circular, like water draining from a basin. He claimed he woke the next morning alone, his father gone. Yet the innkeeper served him breakfast with serene composure, saying only, "He found what he was looking for." Ashworth's obsession deepened. He located Mrs. Thorne's personal effects, stored in a trunk at a solicitor's office in Wakefield. Among them were journals written in a cipher of her own devising, interspersed with pressed flowers, sketches of pie crusts, and meticulous notes on digestion times. One passage, decoded with the aid of a Cambridge linguist, read, "They come hungry, not knowing they hunger for themselves. The feast is not of flesh, but of memory. To taste oneself is to remember what was lost before birth." Another entry, dated October 1889, simply stated, "The oven sings tonight." The revelation came not in words, but in sound. While cataloguing the trunk's contents, Ashworth discovered a wax cylinder hidden inside a hollowed-out cookbook. When played on a phonograph, it emitted not speech, but a layered chorus of voices, whispering, humming, chewing, overlaid with the crackle of a slow-burning fire. Experts later confirmed the voices included those of at least 7 missing persons, their tones not pained, but eerily content. One voice, faint but clear, murmured, "I am home." Ashworth never published his findings. His final journal entry, dated March 1923, reads, "She did not kill them. She fed them back to themselves, and in doing so made them whole." The Red Hollow Inn was demolished in 1931, its stones carted away for road fill. Today, only a moss-covered foundation remains, half swallowed by bracken. Yet locals still speak of an odd phenomenon on certain October nights, a scent of baking pastry on the wind, though no ovens burn for miles. And if one stands very still near the old well, just before dawn, they might hear it, the faint circular melody of a harmonium playing to an empty room. There are places in England where history does not fade. It waits, and sometimes it invites you in for supper. There are those who claim the land itself remembers. Not in words, of course. Land has no tongue, but in the way mist clings longer over certain hollows, or how birds fall silent when passing over a particular stretch of moor. In the decades following the demolition of the Red Hollow Inn, the valley acquired a reputation not for malevolence, but for an unsettling stillness, as though time there moved through thicker air. Farmers reported livestock refusing to graze near the old well site. Iker spoke of compasses spinning lazily when within 100 yards of the foundation stones. None of this was documented in official records, such things rarely are. But it persisted in the quiet exchanges between neighbours, in the way mothers would tighten their grip on a child's hand when the path skirted too close to the western ridge. Dr. Ashworth, after his discovery of the wax cylinder, withdrew from academic circles. He took rooms in a boarding house in Harrogate, where he spent his remaining years transcribing the cylinder's sounds into musical notation, convinced the hum held a grammatical structure. Colleagues who visited him recalled a man grown gaunt and spectral, his study papered with overlapping staves and diagrams linking pie recipes to lunar phases. He became convinced that Mrs. Thorne had not acted alone, nor even as a murderer in the conventional sense, but as a kind of custodian, a priestess perhaps, of an older order that understood hunger not as lack, but as a form of communion. His notes reference obscure folk rites from the Dales, where communal meals were said to bind the living to the dead through shared substance, though never with such literal interpretation. "She did not serve them to others," he wrote in a letter never sent. "She served them to themselves, and in that act they ceased to be strangers, even to their own souls." The cylinder itself vanished after Ashworth's death in 1927. His landlady claimed she heard music the night he passed, not from any instrument, but from the walls themselves, and in the morning found his window open, the bed neatly made and the phonograph silent. The cylinder was gone. Some say it was taken by a distant relative. Others whisper it simply dissolved, having fulfilled its purpose. But in 1954, during the renovation of a public library in Keighley, a workman discovered a small tin box sealed behind a false panel in the rare manuscripts room. Inside lay a single sheet of music paper, covered in Ashworth's precise hand, titled The Feast of Red Hollow. The score contained no lyrics, only a repeating motif in a minor key, harmonized in thirds and fifths with an unusual instruction at the bottom, to be played only when the listener is alone. And already thinking of someone lost, that sheet, now housed in the Yorkshire Archaeological Society's private collection, has never been performed publicly. Those who have studied it report a peculiar effect. After prolonged examination, the notes seem to shift slightly on the page, as though resisting fixed interpretation. One archivist confessed that late one evening, she believed she heard the melody playing softly from an empty reading room, though all windows were shut and no instruments were present. She left the building and never returned. Meanwhile, the guest ledger from the Red Hollow Inn, long presumed destroyed, resurfaced in 1978 among the effects of a retired railway clerk in Doncaster. Its pages, brittle with age, bore the names of over 200 guests between 1859 and 1889. What struck researchers was not the list itself, but the consistency of the ink. Every entry, regardless of the year, appeared to have been written with the same pen, the same hand, Mrs. Thorne's. Yet cross-referencing with surviving railway manifests confirmed that many of those individuals had indeed stayed at the inn, often for only a single night. Stranger still, several names appeared more than once, years apart, with identical handwriting and phrasing: arrived weary, departed satisfied. One name, Thomas Wren, naturalist, was listed 7 times between 1863 and 1881. Historical records show Thomas Wren died in 1864. The implications gnawed at those who studied the ledger. Had Mrs. Thorne been fabricating entries? Or had something about the inn allowed or compelled certain guests to return again and again, drawn by a hunger they could not name? A folklorist from Leeds University proposed a theory that the inn occupied a liminal space, a threshold where the boundary between self and other thinned, and where consumption became a form of recognition. To eat the pie was not to be devoured, but to remember a deeper self, one woven from all the lives one might have lived or lost. In this light, the bones in the oven were not evidence of slaughter, but of shedding, the discarded shells of identities no longer needed. No photograph of Mrs. Thorne exists. Contemporary descriptions vary. Some recall her as severe, with grey hair pinned tightly. Others speak of a woman with soft eyes and flour-dusted sleeves, humming as she rolled dough. But all agree on one detail: she never ate with her guests. She would serve, clear and vanish into the kitchen, where the oven door would click shut with finality. Witnesses recalled the warmth of the dining room, the clink of cutlery, the rich aroma of pastry, but never the sound of her chewing. It was as though she sustained herself on something else entirely, the quiet sigh of recognition when a guest took their first bite. The moment their eyes widened, not in fear, but in remembrance. Today, the site of Red Hollow is marked only by a leaning boundary stone, half buried in ferns. On still October nights, when the moon hangs low and the moor exhales its damp breath, locals say you can hear it, not a scream, not a cry, but the soft rhythmic scrape of a rolling pin on wood, followed by the gentle hiss of fat hitting hot iron. And if you stand very close to the old well, you might catch, just beneath the wind, the faintest echo of a tune, circular, wordless, and strangely comforting, as though someone, somewhere, is still setting a place for you at the table. The persistence of Red Hollow in the collective memory of the West Riding defies conventional explanation. It is not the sort of place that inspires ghost tours or sensational pamphlets. Its horror lies not in spectacle, but in implication, in the quiet suggestion that one might, without knowing, have already partaken in its rites. In the 1980s, a doctoral student from Oxford, researching Victorian hospitality customs, stumbled upon a curious footnote in a ledger from the Sheffield Assizes, a dismissed case from 1886 involving a travelling tinker who claimed the inn's meat pies tasted of his childhood home, though he'd never been there. The magistrate had dismissed the man as drunk, but the student, Eleanor Voss, no relation to the earlier Miss Vane, though the coincidence was noted, became intrigued. She traced the tinker's route and found that he had vanished 2 weeks after his court appearance, last seen walking east toward Red Hollow, muttering about a debt to repay and pastry. Voss's investigation led her to interview elderly residents of nearby hamlets, many of whom recalled their grandparents speaking of the woman who fed the lost back to themselves. One woman, then in her 90s, described how her great-aunt, a schoolteacher who disappeared in 1883, had written home just before her final journey, saying she felt drawn to a place where I might finally understand why I dream in someone else's voice. Voss compiled these accounts with methodical care, avoiding the language of the supernatural, framing everything as psychological folklore. Yet even she admitted in private correspondence that certain patterns resisted rational framing, the recurrence of specific dates, the uncanny similarity in the phrasing of letters written decades apart, the way the inn's guest book entries seemed to anticipate arrivals before they occurred. Her most unsettling discovery came not from archives, but from soil. In 1987, with permission from the current landowner, a reclusive sheep farmer who refused to set foot on the eastern third of his property, Voss conducted a limited archaeological survey of the old kitchen site. Using ground-penetrating radar, her team detected anomalies beneath the collapsed hearth. Not more bones, but a series of shallow, circular pits arranged in a spiral. Excavation revealed layers of ash, charred pastry crusts, and fragments of ceramic plates, all dated to the late 19th century. But intermixed with the debris were hundreds of tiny slips of paper, each bearing a single word in faded ink. Remember, return again, mine. Chemical analysis showed the ink contained traces of iron gall and human blood, though in quantities too minute for forensic identification. Voss published her findings in a regional journal, omitting the blood detail. She resigned her post the following year and moved to the Outer Hebrides, where she was said to spend her days transcribing seabird calls into musical scores. The legend, however, continued to evolve. In the early 2000s, a local historian digitizing parish burial records noticed an anomaly. Between 1860 and 1890, Red Hollow and its surrounding parishes reported an unusually high number of unknown or unclaimed burials, bodies found on moorland roads, in drainage ditches, or simply lying in fields at dawn, fully clothed, with no signs of violence. Many were listed as presumed travelers, yet cross-referencing with railway and coaching records showed no corresponding spike in missing persons reports. It was as though these individuals had ceased to exist before they were ever missed. Stranger still, several of the unclaimed dead were buried with small, hand-formed pastry shells placed over their hearts, dry, intact, and smelling faintly of time. This practice, never documented in any mortuary ledger, was corroborated decades later when a drainage project near Penistone unearthed a forgotten pauper's cemetery. Among the shallow graves, archaeologists found the same ceramic-like pastry discs, hardened by time into a substance resembling bone china. One disc, recovered from a coffin marked only with the initials TW, bore the imprint of a thumbprint on its underside. Forensic comparison with a wax seal from Thomas Wren's 1862 field journal, held at the Natural History Museum, revealed a match. Wren, officially deceased in 1864, had apparently been buried twice. Such findings suggest not a spree of murders, but a ritual economy of return, a system in which identity was not erased, but recycled, fed back into the communal memory through consumption. Mrs. Thorne, if she was its architect, may have seen herself not as a predator but as a restorer. In an age of industrial anonymity, when men and women were uprooted daily by rail and trade, perhaps the inn offered a terrible solace, the chance to taste oneself again, to be known even if only by one's own flesh. The horror lies not in the act, but in the longing it fulfilled. No will, no estate records, no death certificate for Eliza Thorne has ever been found. Some speculate she fled abroad. Others believe she simply ceased to be when the last guest departed. But a more persistent rumor holds that she never left at all, that she became part of the house itself, as the house became part of those who ate there. In 2012, during a drought that cracked the earth near the old well, a hiker reported seeing in the fissure what looked like the curve of a woman's shoulder, pale as biscuit dough, unmoving beneath the soil. He took no photograph. When he returned with authorities, the crack had closed. Today, the land is overgrown, the path to Red Hollow all but vanished beneath bramble and heather. Yet on certain evenings, always in October, always when the wind blows from the west, a scent rises from the earth, warm, spiced, unmistakably of pie. And if one listens closely, beneath the rustle of dry grass and the distant cry of curlews, there is the soft, rhythmic tap of a knife on a wooden board, steady as a heartbeat. It does not invite, it does not threaten, it simply prepares. For someone is always hungry, and somewhere a table remains set. The silence of Red Hollow is not empty, it is expectant. Those who have stood upon its soil, archaeologists, folklorists, the rare pilgrim drawn by whispers, often describe a sensation not of dread, but of being gently observed, as though the land itself were holding its breath, waiting to see if the visitor will understand. In 2017, a team from the University of Leeds undertook a spectral analysis of the site, not in search of ghosts, but of acoustic anomalies. Their equipment, calibrated to detect infrasound and resonant frequencies below human hearing, recorded a persistent low hum emanating from the vicinity of the old kitchen hearth, a vibration that matched no known geological or atmospheric source. More curiously, when played back at triple speed, the hum resolved into a series of overlapping whispers, none intelligible as language, yet all bearing the cadence of polite dinner conversation, the murmur of thanks, the clink of spoons, the soft intake of breath before a bite. This recording, classified under environmental anomalies, unverified, was never published. One technician later confided that after 3 nights of processing the audio, he began dreaming of dining alone in a warmly lit room, served by a woman whose face he could never quite see, though her hands, dusted with flour, steady and sure, were vividly clear. In each dream, the meal concluded with a single slice of pie placed before him, its crust imprinted with his own initials. He woke each time just before tasting it, drenched in sweat, yet filled with an inexplicable sense of peace. He left the project shortly thereafter, citing personal reasons. Meanwhile, fragments of Mrs. Thorne's influence continued to surface in unexpected places. In 2009, a conservator restoring a set of Victorian recipe books at the Bodleian Library discovered marginalia in a copy of Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management that did not match the printer's hand. Tucked between pages detailing game pies were annotations in a fine looping script. Use only marrow from the femur. It carries memory best, and bake until the crust sings. That is when the guest begins to remember. The volume had been donated in 1923 by an anonymous benefactor listed only as a friend of lost things. Cross-referencing. Donation logs led researchers to a small estate sale in Harrogate, the same town where Dr. Ashworth spent his final years. Whether he owned the book or merely passed it on remains unknown, but the handwriting bore a striking resemblance to his late-period notes. Even more unsettling was the discovery, in 2021, of a cache of ceramic shards in the cellar of a derelict boarding house in Scarborough, the very town where the retired vicar had lived. The shards, when reassembled, formed a shallow dish, unglazed on the interior, with a faint residue that chemical testing identified as a mixture of sweet, bone ash, and traces of opium. Etched into the base, nearly worn away, was a symbol, a circle bisected by a vertical line resembling both an eye and a closed mouth. Local historians recalled that this mark had appeared on several gravestones in the Red Hollow parish churchyard before its collapse in 1910, always on the graves of those listed as found, wandering or unknown origin. The symbol, never documented in ecclesiastical records, seems to have been a private sigil, understood only by those who had sat at Mrs. Thorne's table. What binds these scattered remnants is not violence, but intimacy. The horror of Red Hollow does not lie in death, but in recognition. In the moment a guest realizes the taste on their tongue is not foreign, but deeply, unnervingly familiar. Contemporary psychologists might call it a dissociative echo, a somatic memory triggered by scent or texture. But the consistency of the phenomenon across decades, the precision of its recurrence, suggests something older, a covenant written not in ink, but in appetite. Mrs. Thorne may have believed she was offering redemption, that by consuming a piece of themselves, her guests could reintegrate what modern life had fractured. Identity, in her view, was not fixed, but cyclical, like dough kneaded and rebaked until it remembered its original form. No photograph, no portrait, no confirmed description of her face survives. Yet in dreams reported independently by at least 7 individuals connected to the case, Ashworth, the vicar, Voss, the technician, and others, she appears always the same. Eyes downcast, apron clean, hands moving with unhurried purpose. She never speaks. She does not need to. Her presence is announced by the scent of time and rendered fat, by the soft sigh of the oven door opening. By the way, the candlelight seems to pool warmly around an empty chair at the head of the table. In 2023, during a routine survey for a proposed wind farm, drone imagery revealed a faint geometric pattern beneath the vegetation near the old well, a spiral matching the arrangement of the pits Voss had excavated decades earlier. Ground teams found nothing visible at the surface, but soil samples taken from the spiral's center contained elevated levels of calcium phosphate and organic compounds consistent with long decomposed pastry. More tellingly, pollen analysis showed an anomalous concentration of Thymus vulgaris, common thyme, despite the plant not growing naturally in that part of the moor. It was as though the earth itself continued to season the memory of the feast. There are no plans to build on the site. The wind farm proposal was quietly withdrawn, citing unforeseen ecological sensitivities. Locals say little, but they watch. They know better than to speak of Red Hollow after dusk. And yet, on certain still nights, when the mist curls low over the valley and the moon casts long shadows through the skeletal hawthorns, one might hear it, not a scream, not a plea, but the gentle scrape of a serving spoon against porcelain, followed by the soft exhalation of someone finally, fully, at home. For the truth of Red Hollow is not that people vanished there. It is that they were found, and once found, they chose or were compelled to stay, folded into the crust of the world, waiting to be tasted again by those who hunger not for food, but for themselves. The inn is gone. The ovens are cold. But the table, somewhere beneath the roots and stone, remains set, and the melody, wordless, circular, patient, plays on. The persistence of Red Hollow in the margins of official history speaks less to its obscurity than to a collective, unspoken agreement to let certain truths lie undisturbed. Archives, after all, are curated not only by scholars, but by silence, by the quiet decisions of clerks, curators, and keepers of records who sense, perhaps instinctively, that some doors ought not be reopened. Yet the story seeps through, like damp through old plaster, in footnotes, misfiled correspondence, and the hushed recollections of those whose families lived too close to the moor's edge. In 2019, a retired archivist from the West Yorkshire County Record Office confessed in a private letter to a distant cousin that As a young man in the 1960s, he had been tasked with sorting through a box of unclaimed estate documents from the Red Hollow parish. Among them was a single sheet of vellum, brittle and foxed, bearing a list of names, not of the dead, but of those returned to the table. Each entry included a date, a dish served, and a notation in Latin, gustatus est. She has tasted. The sheet vanished before it could be catalogued. The archivist claimed he placed it in the wrong folder out of unease, but admitted, decades later, that he sometimes wondered if the paper had simply refused to be filed, if it had slipped away of its own accord, back into the earth that remembered it. This notion that the story possesses a kind of agency recurs in the testimonies of those who have engaged with it too closely. Dr. Ashworth believed the wax cylinder sought him out. Eleanor Voss spoke of dreams in which the pastry discs whispered her name. The Leeds technician claimed the audio file reappeared on his computer after deletion, labeled only as dinner. There is a pattern here not of haunting, but of invitation, an almost courteous summons, extended to those whose curiosity borders on longing. For Red Hollow does not prey on the careless. It responds to the searching. It answers hunger with hunger. In 2024, a curious anomaly emerged during the digitization of Victorian Railway dining car menus. Among the scanned documents from the Midland Railway Company was a single menu dated October 1888, listing a special dish available only on the Leeds-Sheffield line. Red Hollow pie, a proprietary recipe, served with gratitude. The dish was priced modestly, described as game and root vegetables in a herb-infused crust, and bore a small emblem in the corner, the same closed-eye sigil found on the ceramic dish in Scarborough. No other railway menu from the period mentions the dish. Company ledgers show no contract with any inn or supplier by that name. And yet, 3 passenger diaries from 1888, unrelated, held in separate private collections, mention having eaten the pie aboard the train and experiencing a dream so vivid it felt like memory. One diarist wrote, "I wept without knowing why, as though I had just embraced someone I'd lost before I was born." This suggests Mrs. Thorne's influence may have extended beyond the inn itself, perhaps through emissaries, or through something more intangible, a recipe that carried its own logic, its own gravity. Recipes, after all, are spells in disguise, precise invocations of transformation, where flour, fat, and fire conspire to make something greater than the sum of its parts. What if hers was not merely a method of cooking, but of calling, of drawing the lost back into the fold through the oldest of human rituals, the shared meal? In an age when identity was increasingly fractured by migration, industry, and empire, the promise of wholeness, even at such a cost, might have been irresistible. No evidence exists that Mrs. Thorne ever left Red Hollow, yet her presence lingers in unexpected corners. In 1991, a conservator restoring a harmonium in a church near Halifax discovered, tucked inside the bellows, a slip of music paper bearing the same circular melody Ashworth had transcribed. The instrument had been donated in 1892 by an anonymous widow. In 2005, a genealogist tracing the descendants of missing travelers found that several families, unconnected by blood or geography, shared a peculiar tradition. On the last night of October, they would bake a small, thyme-scented pie and leave it on the doorstep. For the one who remembers us. None could explain the origin of the custom. They only knew it had always been done. The most haunting testament, however, comes not from paper or artifact, but from the land itself. Soil samples taken from the Red Hollow site in 2022 revealed microbial communities unlike any found in surrounding areas, bacteria that thrive in high heat, low oxygen environments typically associated with prolonged baking or charring. Yet there has been no fire there for over a century. More astonishingly, these microbes produce a volatile organic compound that, when aerosolized, triggers activity in the human brain's hippocampus, the region governing memory and spatial navigation. Volunteers exposed to the compound in controlled settings reported vivid, emotionally charged recollections of places they had never visited, often involving a warm room, a kind woman, and the certainty that I belonged. The effect lasted only minutes, but the sense of loss upon its passing was described as profound. This lends a chilling plausibility to the old accounts. The pies were not merely symbolic. They were biochemical vessels carrying not just flesh, but encoded memory, perhaps even fragments of consciousness, preserved in fat and flour, reactivated by heat and taste. Mrs. Thorne may have been less a killer than a curator of selves, gathering the scattered pieces of those who wandered too far from their own souls and offering them back, one bite at a time. The horror is not in the consumption, but in the consent, in the quiet nod a guest gives when the first forkful touches their tongue and they whisper, without meaning to, "Yes, this is me." Today, the site is cordoned off by a rusted iron fence, erected not by authorities, but by local farmers who say their sheep grow listless if they graze too near the old well. No sign marks the reason. None is needed. The air there is heavier, the light softer, as though the world holds its breath. And on certain evenings, always in the waning days of October, when the wind carries the scent of wood smoke from distant farms, a sound rises from the earth, not music, not voice, but the gentle, rhythmic tap of a rolling pin on wood, steady as a pulse. It does not call, it does not demand, it simply waits, for the table is never truly empty. Someone is always coming home.